his question is if you think Bitcoin will or should be a store of value or a medium of exchange. Yes, and if you think it will one prevail over the other, or if eventually it will be just the same things, unit of account, store of value, medium of exchange, but one more important than the other. Anyone want to give an initial answer? Yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think for a store of value, people are thinking about less volatility than Bitcoin has today. So a lot of people will say that Bitcoin is seeing adoption leading towards becoming a store of value. And I mean, another thing to consider is as a kind of technology adoption curve, a new money system, and even, and so eventually everybody who is interested in the properties of this money will have adopted it, and then there will be less adoption curve left, some, you know, many years in the future. And at that point, I think you have to bear in mind that even gold has fairly high volatility compared to fiat currencies and some counter-cyclical properties. So if you consider Bitcoin to be a competitor, like a digital gold competitor to physical gold, then, you know, some ratio to gold, you know, if it could match gold, obviously that would create a very high Bitcoin per Bitcoin price. But, you know, if it was some reasonable percentage of gold, it has advantages and disadvantages. So it definitely has some advantages over what you can do with gold. Some more bearer guarantees that you can verify that you have a full physical Bitcoin more easily than many forms of gold. And obviously you can spend it at a distance and that kind of thing. So, and it's very cheap to verify that you have a full Bitcoin. If you want to check, even if you have physical possession and you want to check you have real gold, it's complicated to have it assayed. So Bitcoin has kind of real-time, free, essentially, assay. And the medium of exchange question, I mean, I think Bitcoin is already used as a medium of exchange. That doesn't imply a particular price. It just means that it has payment advantages. And clearly it does, and many people use Bitcoin for different kinds of payments for a whole range of reasons already today.
So you mean medium of exchange has not to do with the price, but with the capacity of being transferred and stable during the transfer?
Yeah, I mean, if you are wanting to transfer money somewhere to somebody without a bank account, or where the banking is unreliable, or for privacy reasons, or for some gray market use case, then you can use Bitcoin today. And there are many use cases for which there is no alternative. And I think some of the use cases for payment that Bitcoin satisfies are even, you know, they're very defensible because banks essentially can't compete with them. They're approximately prevented from competing with them by regulations and by their own assumptions and their own cost bases of how they operate.
If I may add something,
yeah.
We are using the word Bitcoin to refer to two different things. One is an asset, a financial asset class, a new form of digital commodity, and one is the system to move at the base layer this kind of asset, which is the Bitcoin protocol. And this is different from previous experiments. For example, when you have, for example, eCash, the fundamental asset is British pounds in a bank account, and then you are just using this transfer system on top of a fundamental asset which is already has already been bootstrapped. Or if you have e-gold, you have the physical gold with its history of store of value, and you are just adding a transfer platform. With Bitcoin, we had to do both. So the thing is that Bitcoin itself can be a transactional form of money because it can be transacted on the Bitcoin blockchain or off the Bitcoin blockchain, both in trust-based centralized fiduciary mean, just like a bank, or on trustless second layer systems, just like Lightning. So the Bitcoin blockchain probably will not scale up enough to be a day-to-day transactional system. But the Bitcoin asset can scale to be a day-to-day transactional asset class outside the Bitcoin blockchain. So it's not that the two things are the same. The Bitcoin blockchain is mostly probably for settlement. It will be mostly probably for settlement, but all the other all the other tools that we have on top of that, trusted or trustless, can be used in order to scale the asset outside the platform itself.
Very good. Yes, I will listen 2 questions at the same time. I will decide who takes the... Yes?
Thank you very much. I would like very much if you could please describe or give your opinion about this recent phenomenon that EOS experiences. We all know that many of the coins are on a downtrend or so, but there has been a special downtrend in EOS in the recent week, so, and today it goes on. So if you could give like your opinion of what is behind it, what was the phenomenon behind it, like to try to understand what's going on, and not try to forecast the price, of course, but try to understand the phenomenon would be much helpful.
On EOS?
On EOS, yeah.
Anyone here has...
I mean, I don't know much about, I haven't been tracking the prices of different sort of programmable platforms, but I think there was a panel yesterday where people were talking about different platforms. There was somebody from Ethereum and so on panel, and one of the topics is, you know, the value of the token in a programmable platform depends on the, you know, how successful the platform is. At least that's the idea, right? So if different platforms become more popular, or if some of the use cases for platforms slow down, it could affect platform token prices, I guess. So that was why I was saying that sidechains are interesting, because you can potentially use platforms without having to, you know, buy the asset to use a platform. So you can just use Bitcoin. So to my point of view, there is Bitcoin, which is this very interesting, bearer, sensor-resistant money, and then there are many things you can build with that. And it seems to me that if you want to, you can build most things using just that. And the reason that people use, you know, issue their own coins is some kind of hybrid between shares and an incentive program for people to promote or work on the project.
Okay.
I think it's pretty much a given that all scam coins are going to hit zero at some point. It's just a matter of when.
Yeah.
So,
Please. At least the Bitcoiners.
so
Yes.
Adam's answer was a great segue to my question. I'm over here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're the one who raised the hand there?
I raised my hand. The
Thank
microphone
you.
didn't really
You
make
did
its way
right.
over to there.
You're great.
So you know,
Thank you for coming
if
to the
Muhammad
microphone.
doesn't go to the mountain, then,
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, we could do that. People who want could go to the microphone. Yeah? Okay. That would be great. Why you're first? Ah, okay. Nice. Bueno, later.
So, you know, we've been hearing about sidechains now for probably give or take 4 or 5 years, 5 years probably at this point. And we've all seen the amount of excitement that there's been around Ethereum because of the additional development opportunities it provides. And at the same time, with Bitcoin, one has the feeling that we're coming towards the end of the period where major feature advancements are likely to get integrated. You know, we may still have a few more years of grace, but the feeling is that for good or for ill, and probably for good, the system is becoming what it is. So I wanted to ask your thoughts on where we stand, both like, you know, Zuko, his thoughts on how, you know, potentially, yeah, what you guys are developing could be a sidechain. Adam, you certainly have been very involved in sidechains. Where do we stand in that? And in particular, I'm interested in your thoughts on drive chain, because that seems to be something which is coming close to fruition right now.
Sorry, first.
What's the question?
Are we all... Okay. Do we all agree that Bitcoin is reaching its limits of new evolution and changes, or is a personal approach? What do you think about that?
I think that we're not ready for that, but it does seem that the community is solidifying on not allowing changes. It seems already we've reached the point where hard forks may very well be impractical to get consensus on.
You agree also?
I mean, I think there's quite a lot of, there are different types of changes. So Luke gave a very good presentation yesterday about consensus and non-consensus changes. So things which are technologically win-win and don't involve consensus changes are much less controversial, and Bitcoin has a lot of proposals in that space at the moment, you know, like Taproot and MAST and Schnorr signatures and all these kinds of things. So there's quite a lot of activity, like developer cycles and thinking about those protocol improvements, but they tend to be, I guess it's just a general to, to the question, with a store of value, people thank you more for making it safe and secure and dependable than, move fast and break things and create a lot of excitement, because it's not exciting if it breaks, or it's exciting in the wrong way. So I think for Bitcoin, the flavor has generally been to be careful and put a lot of focus on testing. But there is a lot of activity, like in Lightning, which is non-consensus changes typically, and different implementations or different protocols can compete at that level without any need for basic protocol changes, or if there are protocol changes, so far they've been able to do things with soft forks that help Lightning be more efficient. And there's some more things like that, like SIG hash no input, which is being considered.
So
but
basically sounds like we all agree with the questioner's statement.
Well, I think it's, you could say that it's kind of a macro level, it's staying true to its purpose, like it's kind of a Unix philosophy to do one thing and do it well. But it's, there's a lot of engineering effort and a lot of development cycles going into it. I mean, it's one of the most active GitHub projects, even outside of crypto, right? So there's a lot of engineers working on improving it. So there are many changes that are going in, but they are trying to be very careful and stay away from changing big things.
So you would say that most changes has to do with consensus, and consensus needs to be reached, as was the speech before. You would say that eventually most new innovations are more prompt to occur on the side chains that eventually on any Bitcoin change.
Was that the question?
When do we expect to see non-federated sidechains? Like the exciting development this year has been federated sidechains. When do we expect to see non-federated sidechains? And in particular, I'm interested in DriveChain and your thoughts on it.
DriveChain has a significantly different security model. I expect we'll probably be able to get that in before Bitcoin solidifies too much. Decentralized sidechains in general have mostly been, I don't want to say a lost cause, but very much hampered by the centralization in mining.
But aren't drive chains an example of decentralized sidechains?
They are kind of decentralized, but it gives miners a lot of control over the sidechain. They can essentially take all the funds from the sidechain if they decide to.
And so you're saying you think that will go into Bitcoin, but nothing else will?
I don't see any reason that would impede that going in. I think a lot of the interest in decentralized sidechains is dried up simply because the mining ecosystem is so centralized, it's not really safe to use them for any large quantity of Bitcoins.
Huh.
So there are, of course, I think Adam knows more and Luke knows more about this, but there is an old proposal by Gregory Maxwell about a non-mining based two-way peg system, which is based on zero-knowledge proof, compact proofs. So you don't have to validate the state of the sidechain, but you just receive a zero-knowledge proof of the state. So you can peg out knowing that the sidechain are not lying to you without trusting the miners.
Who's that by?
That the name was Coin Witness, but I think back then Gregory said that the technology for this kind of stuff is still in rapid evolution and not ready for a production. I don't know if it's still...
It was described by G. Maxwell? Is that who you said?
Yeah.
Coin Witness?
Coin Witness, yeah. 2012, I think, 2013.
I think it was the same thread as the coin join.
Okay.
That's promising because zero-knowledge proofs have improved a lot since 2012 and are still probably going to improve a lot in the next couple of years.
It might also be important to keep in mind that even though it seems to be more difficult to get consensus now, it's not impossible for that trend to reverse at some point.
It's not impossible for that trend to reverse?
Right.
I mean, I think, the general question was also about how do we see change, protocol change evolving in the future. So I think it's possible for both in the sense that most network stacks and technologies are modular and layered, and Bitcoin started out very monolithic, but there is very strong interest to modularize and have different layers. So you can see Lightning and Liquid and rootstock and a drive chain as an example of a layer 2. And so you could see that the small consensus changes needed to better support layer 2 are attractive things to do, because then people can do experiments and try more adventurous or faster changing things in different layers in a more modular way. And that would allow potentially the base layer to become more static and still see a lot of protocol evolution. And it's kind of like what happened with TCP, right? So the IP protocol, apart from IPv6, which took decades, basically the IP stuff hasn't changed for a really, really long time, and yet there's an enormous amount of protocol evolution at different layers. So ideally, it's complicated to think about how to sort of improve Bitcoin's architecture incrementally, because it's a running system with extremely high security requirements. That would be a good direction. And so it's one of the advantages of sidechains. So they have different security trade-offs, but the advantage is you can pretty much take on high-risk things in them, because if they go wrong, the only people that are at risk are people who put money into them, and they can plan accordingly.
And again, I hate to be repetitive, but again, what do you mean with Bitcoin development? Do you think that internet did not evolve since 1983? The IP4 version is basically static since then, but it must be because if you want to build on top of a standard, you need the standard to be stable. And so IP is not really evolving much. TCP IP6 is still, let's say, we're still migrating. So the Bitcoin-based layer is probably going to get more and more stable, but we will call probably Bitcoin all the layer stack of things that happen on top of Bitcoin. So we could say that we call the internet the set of internet protocol and TCP. We will probably call Bitcoin BPLNP, like a Bitcoin protocol, Lightning Network Protocol, as a suite of different layered protocols.
Okay, I'm not sure if we will someone use Bitcoin for all the layers, but perhaps like a complementary Bitcoin and something else eventually.
As an asset,
I don't think.
As a platform, probably not. Not everything will be based on the Bitcoin blockchain. But as an asset, when you want digital scarcity, I don't see why to use something else. If you don't want digital scarcity, if you want shares or stocks, if you want collectibles.
Absolutely, what I say, I don't think that layers on top of Bitcoin will be named as a general concept of Bitcoin. I would disagree on that. Bueno, Gabriel.
One question.
And then Peter, you want to ask. So.
Talking about the Bitcoin layer being stable, where do you foresee proof of work in 10 years? And is there a scenario where you see the protocol moving away from SHA to 56?
I think the cryptographic assumptions that proof of work is making of the hash function are quite conservative. So even if the hash function became weak for signatures or something like that, it would still be, if you look at the history of previous hash functions that have degraded over time, like MD4, MD5, SHA-1 very slightly, the types of problems they've had, and particularly the more recent ones, wouldn't really affect their use as a proof of work. So I think that it's probable that SHA-256 can easily survive for a couple of decades even, but if it didn't, if it had a significant problem where, basically if it becomes easier, that doesn't matter because the difficulty adjusts. The problem is if it becomes easier in a way that creates centralization, where there's a big pre-computation you can do, so if a big player, you get an advantage or something like that. And a problem like that would need to phase in a new hash function, like SHA-3 or something.
Of course, we had that problem with ASIC boost, and I think pretty much every reason to change the algorithm arose a year ago, and the community still couldn't come to consensus on a change. So I think realistically it probably won't happen, even, no matter how much it's needed.
Paradoxically, the reason for the change is not that the mining was becoming too easy because of a broken function, but too difficult. I mean, the proposal was about switching to a proof of work which was more ASICs friendly in order to lower the barrier to competition. So it's a problem of eventually moving toward the ASICs friendlier algorithm than this.
So you don't see external reasons for making a change from proof of work to somewhere else in any near future?
Well, I mean, the main alternative people think about is like proof of stake related things, but I think they are, you know, even if they technically worked, and typically they seem to always circle back to, you know, being able to recalculate the entire history for no cost effectively, and to prevent that, they put rolling checkpoints, and then they have problems with subjectivity and race conditions around the rolling checkpoint time event. But I think the bigger question is it even desirable? You know, if proof of stake actually worked and didn't have those, what seem like fundamental design problems, do we even want it? Because it means that people who have money receive interest for doing nothing. Basically, the new coins go to the people who already have money. So, you know, if Bitcoin had proof of stake from the beginning, Satoshi would own, you know, 99.9% of the coins, and Hal Finney's descendants would own the rest, or something like that.
True
Well,
of proof
keep
of
in
work.
mind the block reward and the block subsidy don't need to be tied necessarily to, even if we moved the actual block creation to proof of stake at some point, if it became possible, that wouldn't necessarily mean the inflation would go to those miners.
Okay, so you're saying you could have two consensus algorithms. I mean, you could have mining to get new coins, as today, and you could have a different consensus algorithm to order blocks, for
Correct.
example.
It's certainly a possibility if it were to become a viable algorithm.
But your objection applies to proof of work as well. The objection is the rich get richer, but that also applies to proof of work.
I don't know, try mining. It's very high risk. You can become poorer.
There's a
mining too.
difference. You can't, in proof of stake, unless I give part of my stake, you can't ever get my share. Yes? I mean, I have 20%. There's no way you can get more shares than me. In the proof of work, yes, you could economically try to change.
So the risk you're both referring to is that competitive miners will outcompete you, and so you'll lose your stake. That's the only
I
difference.
mean, it's a capital investment, right? So you're
In
either
both cases, it's a capital investment.
well, I think
in
it
the proof
is-
of stake case, there's a bounded universe of how many other people could compete with you and subtract from your profitability, which is up to all of the stake in the world could compete, but no more than all of the stake in the world. In the proof of work case, there's no upper bound on how much other work could come in and compete with you and subtract from your profitability.
But I mean, I think in the proof of work case, you've taken a capital investment risk. It's not like you can say, oh, I decided to stop staking and just, you know, sell the coins. No, you have miners and...
I'm sorry, I don't understand the distinction.
Well, I mean, you've taken no risk with stake, right? You can remove your stake at any
This
point.
is true
and
in
you still
both cases. You have to have capital and risk it, and then you might get a profit back or you might lose money.
Yeah, but sunk cost of the investment is different, and old ASICs is very difficult to sell on the market, while some coins you can just take them out of the staking, and you can sell them with less friction than a giant miner equipment, or the fixed kind of real estate operation you have to do in order to install a mining farm. And also there is technological innovation, like in proof of work, the possibility of compete with you could come from some design innovation, while in proof of stake, that's kind of settled.
Right, good point.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're taking a kind of long-term capital investment. So I think it's actually, in a way, Bitcoin's security model is assuming that proof of work has no other function. So it's kind of necessary that you should spend money on this activity, because if there's no cost, you could attack the network.
And with a proof of stake algorithm, we can require you to lock up money. I suppose you could design one that requires you to burn the money. That'd be interesting.
I guess people wouldn't do it then, right?
I don't know.
Well, Peter.
A couple years back, there was a proposal by Dr. Peter Risen called subchains. It's a soft fork idea. I'll briefly describe it. It's using proof of work, dividing the block interval by 10. So you'd use a weak block to give confidence in transactions. And then when the main block is mined, if your transaction wasn't in the weak block, then the main miners would orphan those big blocks. So this would be a soft fork way to give you transaction confidence on like a 1 minute interval instead of a 10-minute interval. And we could also introduce a different proof of work to help with decentralization of mining. And it helps in retail situations. Right now, you have to wait. You're not really paid until it's 10 minutes to 60 minutes, like when there's one confirmation, because you don't know if your transaction is actually mineable. But if we used a weak blocks to create a subchain system, within 60 seconds, you know your transaction is mineable. And I want to get opinions on if you think this is a practical proposal and it's good or worth doing.
Transactions are mineable. You can determine that just by checking the validity of the transaction. The way you described it sounds like it would be vulnerable to, you wouldn't have a way for new nodes to determine if the correct chain is the one you're on unless you look at all those weak blocks in between. So I don't know that it would actually solve any real issue there.
Well, the weak blocks get aggregated into a main block. So when you're validating from Genesis, you wouldn't have to validate any weak blocks.
Right, but you're saying if the main block is missing those transactions, it would be effectively invalid. So the only way a new node can determine if a block is valid is to look at all the weak blocks leading up to it.
It would just be orphaned. So like in the transaction history, you wouldn't know like who got orphaned, but it would be a soft fork orphaning.
But why would that give an additional security? I mean, it's on a weak block and it has not been validated in any way. It's like just
like
trusting that it might be validated, but
it's like we use weak blocks right now to pay out shares in mining pools. So it's a similar security model to that. And then it increases how quick you have a confidence in a transaction.
But I think that the thing is that orphan rate is not neutral. So in theory, we could say with 10 minutes block rate, we can, I mean, we have this security, we have to wait for, let's say, 60 minutes. And with 1 minute block rate, we need to wait 60 minutes anyway, just we wait more fast blocks. But this is not neutral because even from a user experience point of view, you have a better granularity, so you can assess the security with more granularity, not just in very big hopes. On the other side, you just increase the orphan rate because that's a fundamental problem with the broadcasting. The consensus of the distributed nodes of the network and the time of the state change you want to do. So you're increasing orphan rate, and thus you are increasing selfish mining problems and stuff like that, I guess.
One of the proposed benefits is it would actually reduce orphan rates because all the miners would be agreeing on the same transactions in the mempool. Like miners don't know what's in each other's mempool, but they would know that other miners had committed to these weak blocks, and if they don't include those transactions in the main block, then it would be orphaned. So this is a way to get like pre-consensus on the transactions in the block so they can be propagated and you know what the other miners have in their mempools.
Sorry, these weak blocks would be smaller than a final block. So you expect
so if there's 10
so the amount of
zeros,
transactions that could be settled there would be anyway very few, and
It's
the amount of time I would need to expect.
It's not scalability, just better granularity. So the win is not that you get more transaction, is that you get the same transaction with better granularity.
But I mean, without scaling Bitcoin, the core Bitcoin, anyway, you would also need to wait until your transaction goes into this weak small block because there is very few space to put inside. So eventually, you will anyways be waiting a lot of time to get also into those weak blocks. So I don't see.
I think that part of the proposal was borrowed with our attribution from Greg Maxwell, if I'm recalling. There was a sort of related proposal for weak blocks to sort of for pre-consensus, so that when you receive a block, you could recognize it as one you'd seen before, and it wouldn't have to wait to sync it. So it's just a way to sort of reduce latency. But, you know, like Giacomo was saying, if, you know, it could likely basically become a faster block, right? So if you want a faster block, you make a faster block. If you want a bigger block, make a bigger block. You know, if people really wanted a bigger block, then maybe they should use an extension block or a hard fork or something and do that. I mean, there was another proposal for a soft fork block size increase recently using the time warp attack, which was basically to make very fast blocks and tamper with the timestamps.
So we all agree that our clocks are running twice as fast as they are actually running?
Yeah, there's a time warp attack, so some kind of known weakness. But I guess, you know, if people want a better retail experience, Lightning is a better solution because it can be very immediate. And it seems like there's a bad trade-off with consensus systems, right? If you reduce the block interval, you get higher orphan rates generally. And the proposals like weak blocks that reduce the orphan rate by providing pre-consensus have trade-offs. They're like slightly centralizing, you know, because maybe people with more hash rate have more advantage in creating weak blocks. So maybe, you know, if only big miners could manage to make weak blocks, they could sort of weakly censor transactions or something. So there are some disadvantages to, so it's sort of like fiber, right? You know, fiber reduces latency, but it's an overlay network that mostly, you know, a few miners connect to get transactions faster, which, you know, anybody can connect to it, but it is something a bit more hierarchical.
Okay. Santiago Molins from No Soy Satoshi. Saludos.
Thanks, sorry for the interruption. I came to the microphone. So the question is, let's say that we use the main chain, the blockchain, for settlement layer, for instance, a Lightning network. Keeping in mind that we have a size limit of the block, how do you imagine the transaction fees in a scenario where the coin base is reducing? Do you think that the transactions are going to be expensive in general, or we can have cheap transactions even in that scenario?
So the coin base is reducing in Bitcoin term, but that means that it reduces in purchasing power terms only when Bitcoin stop growing. I mean, bearing the short-term volatility. So that's not a problem, an issue for very short-term. But eventually, the more demand you have for block space, if the block space stays the same, the fees are going to go up linearly with the increase of demand, basically. So the point is that you have to leverage the second layer solution anyway. One interesting thing is that with stuff like L2, for example, you can create multi-party channels. So you can use one on-chain transaction to create a multi-party channel, and with L2 plus must and other kind of optimization, you could have like very big multi-party channels. Also with the present channels, you can have things like channel factories. So you can probably try to minimize the amount of on-chain transaction that you need to have the same kind of chain capability. But that's a fundamental problem. Whichever the block space is, there will always be an increase of price with increase of demand for that space.
Of course, the space is metered in bytes on chain. The actual transactions are now on layer 2, where they will be presumably much cheaper than anything on chain. And in addition, by reducing the space people use on chain, when you do have to go on chain for a transaction, maybe it's very high value and you don't want to use L2 for whatever reason, or maybe you need a smart contract that can't be on L2, it's cheaper because everybody else is using less space for their day-to-day transactions.
Sorry, I would like some questions for Soko. Does someone have some question more related to privacy, or, well, you can just find someone related.
Yeah, I have a question actually related to privacy, but it's, I think, for all of them.
They all know about privacy.
So I think that after the noise around scalability, I'm not saying it's not still an issue, but I think now we are leaning towards more focus on privacy. I think there are a lot of conversations and discussions about privacy in Bitcoin specifically, and a lot of people focusing on these privacy coins. But I think that different from scalability, this is an issue that can be challenging in terms of social consensus, probably. I'm not sure even that a lot of people actually want private transactions in Bitcoin.
I agree.
So, right, and so what do you think about that? How do you think this is going to move forward in terms of evolution in Bitcoins? And what other coins like Zcash can add to that evolution?
I mean, I agree. I think it's going to become increasingly important to more and more people, and I agree that there won't be global consensus to do anything.
Mm-hmm. Well, I tried to ask in the question about privacy in Bitcoin Reddit, actually both Reddits, like a year or so ago. And usually when you're talking about scaling or something, of course, both the subreddits have different opinions, and people will have different opinions about trade-offs, but it seemed like for privacy, it was nearly universal that everybody wanted more privacy and more fungibility. So, okay, Reddit is like a small part, but like these days it's 1 million users or something. So it seems like people want privacy and fungibility.
As a counterpoint, I remember a few years ago when a bunch of developers met with a bunch of miners from China, the topic of fungibility came up, and the Chinese miners were like, what is that? And when it was explained to them, they seemed relatively opposed to the idea of even fungibility because they were afraid that China would crack down on Bitcoin as a result, and they'd basically go out of business. So I do expect it will probably be not so easy to get consensus for anything like that. Mm-hmm. I think it's important that we still move toward it and hopefully deploy it in some way or another, maybe just on a side chain if we can't get consensus on the main chain.
Probably the trade-off there will not be, with scalability, the trade-off was between transaction cost and validation cost. Here, there is not a real trade-off between privacy and something else except the change itself. The opposition that I could see is an opposition toward, nobody probably from inside the community will say we don't want privacy, but we don't want any important change in Bitcoin because of all the topic of stability.
You must be defining
sure.
the community as people who agree with you. I know a lot of people who I consider to be part of the community that will object.
I would object.
That would be an objection.
Since long. Actually, I think that the changes that goes through easily are changes that make things more efficient. Yes. So if we get better signatures and less space, and this goes straight. Okay, everybody wants something more efficient. Yes, cheaper, whatever. Changes that make the platform more trustful. Yes, they go through easily because everyone wants transactions to be more secure, yes, less concentrated, less. Now, changes that make the things differently useful, those are the things that fulfills, because value has to do with fulfilling some needs, yes? So my need is different than your need, and your need. We all need it efficiently to be fulfilled, we all need it securely to be fulfilled, but I want this and you want that. So when the issue comes to what are we turning this to fulfill which need, your need is privacy. Okay, my need might not be privacy. Yes, my need.
Well, but then why are you using Bitcoin if your need is not privacy?
Because I like all the other stuff of Bitcoin,
well,
not necessarily
sound money
privacy.
and private money. Basically, those are the two value propositions.
I agree with you, but I agree with, this is clearly core Bitcoin culture. This is why I'm here, this is why you're here, and it's been that way for 10 years. Privacy was basically the #1 killer feature of Bitcoin when it launched. But there's a bunch of newcomers who don't share that value.
Sorry for their loss. They will understand that if they don't share that value, PayPal is better for their need. If they want efficiency, cool tech, they should just avoid distributed systems and maybe use an AWS server with some Node.js on top of it.
I mean, to play devil's advocate, I think there could be people who look at Bitcoin as an investment class and worry that extremely strong privacy would make an ETF less likely or cause an exchange to not list it or something like that. But I mean, I think there's another related property that everybody can agree on, which is if the money is not fungible, it's less valuable. So I think that's a better way to look at it.
I think it's differently valuable. I mean, if it's not fungible, it's useful for this. If it's traceable, it's useful for also this. So it's different kind of uses, yes? I think what I think is that any discussion in the change of the use case, yes, in the change of what this will fulfill with this, that will be hard to get consensus on. So unfortunately or unfortunately, yes, Bitcoin already is somehow related to traceable money, yes? Somehow. I doubt...
There is a lot of discussion about this. I mean,
okay.
Satoshis are inherently fungible. The problem is that there are effective heuristics that right now are used and may be reliable in the short term that can connect the use that people does, but at the transaction level, one Satoshi is perfectly fungible with the other. So if people use the coin join intensively, if every wallet added the wasabi-like Xiaomian coin join, those Satoshis are perfectly fungible. So we have a base layer fungibility, transaction level, not block level.
Yeah. You agree about?
Yeah, I mean, I think you also see new fungibility from Lightning. So, you know, for many types of payment use cases, it's going to get more fungible, actually, because of the privacy that comes with Lightning. I mean, there are like Tor-like encrypted channels in it, and things don't go to chain, so they're not visible. But I mean, I think a money that's not fungible is not a good money because you have a really bad experience, right? And it's starting to affect people. Some of the exchanges, there's a service called Gab.ai recently, and they got cut off by PayPal, and they went to somebody else, and they got cut off, and they went to somebody else. But they're very stubborn. They went through multiple services, and eventually said, okay, we give up. And they're using Bitcoin now, right? So if people use Bitcoin through centralized services and they have an experience which is worse than PayPal, it's going to detract from their experience. And if a lot of, that's part of the reason it's important that people run direct infrastructure. So like the BTC Pay server thing, right? So if you run a web store, so your own web store, and you receive the Bitcoins, you're not like using a service provider like Coinbase or BitPay or something that has policies that are very similar to, or often actually worse than PayPal, because that kind of takes away from the point. So I think if everybody who's receiving, you know, if it becomes very easy to receive directly, then it becomes more fungible de facto. Like, okay, maybe you can trace it, but if you try to pay a merchant and the merchant's payment processor says no, then you can't make the payment, and that kind of ruins the point of Bitcoin in many cases.
Okay. Bueno, we should be closing. I will allow just one question, being a short one and not so debatable one, please.
A question with a simple answer that everyone agrees
with a yes or no. I mean, I want him to say yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no.
And we'll achieve consensus in one round.
Yes, please.
Okay, hello. Thanks for the interesting panel. It's me.
I'm glad it's a woman. Yes, thanks.
Thanks for the interesting panel. I think I have a very clear and short question. So the security of the network to some extent comes with a chip, right?
What?
And
the security of the network comes with what?
The security of the network comes with a chip. I mean, chip of the processor, of the hardware.
The ASIC chip for the miners.
Yeah. No, chip like microchip, microprocessor.
For the mining part, right?
I don't know what you mean by the security of the network comes from a chip.
Yeah.
I don't understand that.
Like in the world, there are 4 major producers of microprocessors. because it's very expensive to produce microprocessor development. So I'm curious, what do you think for the future of blockchains, if it's a concern that the production of microprocessors is centralized?
Okay.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Yes, but there are multiple people creating microprocessors, and there's the new RISC-V, which is also going to hopefully make it even easier for more people to be making their own microprocessors.
I mean, it's also a risk the rest of the supply chain, like the design for the ASICs, the manufacturers, for the miners. So that has been very centralized, but the centralization has improved, I think, in the last year.
I said yes, it's a concern, but I don't agree that the security of the network comes from that.
I interpreted it as CPUs that are running the full nodes.
I don't think the security of the network comes from mining. I think the security of the network comes from the social consensus of what Bitcoin is.
Okay.
But even that is running on CPUs.
But now we're disagreeing again, so now we can't stop the session. We have to keep going.
Well, I mean, I think you started it now, so I think the...
yes was nice, no? But
I mean, like, people use money because they... I mean, so money doesn't have to be perfect for people to use it. There are lots of imperfect monies in the world. So basically, money works because people need and want it to work. But I think one of the beauties of Bitcoin as a kind of hard bearer cash is that you can transact with lots of people you don't like, you disagree with fundamentally on lots of things, because there's a... You know, it's very difficult to overcome the security incentives in the system. So if it's, you know, consensus in like a community sense, okay, we've seen where that goes, right? Like political debates and people trying to roll back other people's transactions, and democracy leads to fiat currency and sort of back to square one, no?
I don't know if we're disagreeing. My claim is that that's what it is, not that's what it should be.
Bueno, guys, a big applause, please.